Hey everyone, it's Tobes, and welcome to your second monitor. Today is the next video in my series of March of the Machine Commander deck techs. I'm covering every legendary creature from the March of the Machine main set in no particular order, plus the extra legends from Mom Jumpstart, the special pre-release promos, and if there's interest, maybe even the non-face legends from the Mom Commander product. So if you have a request for a commander you'd like to see me build or a way you want to see me build them, let me know in the comments below. As you see, today our commander is Urabrask, the red-aligned Phyrexian Praetor. Urabrask is my favorite Praetor because of the way he illustrates the color red in Magic. Red is the color of freedom and emotion, and that includes empathy. He's not a good guy, but while the other Praetors demonstrated just how evil and dangerous colors like white and blue can be, Urabrask actively fought against them, even allowing the oppressed Mirrans to take asylum in his furnace lair. When he was injured on New Capenna, he still tried to help Vivian and Elspeth collect the halo that would be instrumental in overcoming the Phyrexian invasion, and later he led Chandra and Ren to the heart of Realmbreaker. He might be dead now, but he never bent the knee to Elesh Norn, never stopped fighting, no matter how hopeless things became. One must imagine Urabrask happy. What a cool character. Anyway, before we get started, let's go over my deck building template. I like to build my decks around the commander. I want to show off why they're cool and why I put them in my command zone. So whatever they want me to do, I'm going to put 30 cards toward that. That's our game plan. It's what we try to do at the table, how we try to win. About 30 more cards in these three categories of support go towards supporting that game plan: card advantage, acceleration, and interaction. I usually run 1 or 2 Wraths just to keep the board clear, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, depending on what the commander needs. And even if I play with the numbers here, I almost always keep to my floor of 38 lands so I can hit my land drops and make sure I can play the game. So let's talk about our commander. Urabrask is a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian Praetor for 2 and double red. Urabrask has First Strike and has 2 other abilities. The first is whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, Urabrask deals 1 damage to an opponent, and we add a red mana to our pool. We can also spend a single red mana to exile Urabrask and return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, but only as a sorcery and only if we've cast 3 or more instants or sorceries this turn. So on the backside, Urabrask is the great work. It's a saga, so when it enters, it will get its first lore counter, it'll get another one at the start of the next pre-combat made phase on our next turn, and then on the last, or on our turn after that, at the start of our pre-combat main phase, it'll get another lore counter, and it will resolve these abilities once they get counters. So we're already casting instants and sorceries. We've done 3 of them. We've pinged our opponent 3 times. We've paid a red and flipped it, and when we do, the great work deals damage to target opponent and each creature they control. 3 damage, that is. So if it's the same opponent we've sort of been picking on this turn, this is 3 damage they've taken and 3 more damage to them and to each of their creatures. The second chapter is that we make 3 treasure tokens, pretty good. And the third chapter is Past in Flames, kind of. It says, until end of turn, you may cast instant and sorcery spells from any graveyard. If a spell cast this way would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. So this is any graveyard, so we can cast our opponent's spells if we want to. But if we're looking at just our own graveyard, this essentially gives all the cards in our graveyard flashback, which is, like I say, Past in Flames. Instant sorceries in your graveyard gain flashback until end of turn. Flashback cost is equal to the mana cost. So this is not Past in Flames because it lets us cast from our opponent's graveyards too, if we feel like it. And we can't cast these all for free, we have to pay for them, but we do have 3 treasures we just made, and that lets us cast for spells that are not red. In addition, as this resolves, we exile it and return it to the battlefield face up, which is to say, as Urabrask again. So we have this effect, in effect, until the end of our turn. We can cast our or anyone else's instants and sorceries from the graveyard and exile them if we do. But when we cast those, we're, again, pinging an opponent and making red mana. Seems pretty fun. And it should be, I guess, pretty obvious that Urabrask lends himself to spellslinger strategies. But I wanted to do something a little different. It's a type of deck I've been looking forward to building for a long time, and it fits Urabrask's ethos so well. You probably already know what we're doing. based on the video's thumbnail, this is a Dragon's Approach deck. Here is how Dragon's Approach works. This is a sorcery for 2 and a red from Strixhaven that does 3 damage to each opponent. And then we can exile Dragon's Approach and 4 other cards named Dragon's Approach from our graveyard. And if we do, we get to search our library for a dragon, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle. Doesn't make sense in a commander deck because it requires us to have extra copies of Dragon's Approach in the graveyard, except for the fact that Dragon's Approach is one of the cards that lets us have any number of copies of it in our deck. So we have a lot of copies of Dragon's Approach, and we're going to be able to cast it for 3, which will trigger the front side of our commander and ping our opponent, I should say, and then add a mana. So with our commander in play, the 3 damage from Dragon's Approach to each opponent incurs an extra 1 to one opponent. And with Urabrask's rebate of 1 red mana, we get kind of a virtual discount on every copy of Dragon's Approach beyond the first. And we can also use that mana to flip our commander into 3 more damage to that opponent and to their creatures as well. We then have a turn of setup as the Great Work gives us treasures before we absolutely pop off with its 3rd chapter. Sure, we could have exiled our Dragon's Approaches to find a dragon, but being able to flash them back one after another is a lot more value, especially with Urabrask being face up again to give us more pings of damage and more mana for each subsequent spell. Our game plan seems linear, but it feels classically red. Our hand and mana pool stay close to, but not quite, empty as we sequence our way into draw after draw, spell after spell. People think of sorceries as slow, but the speed at which we cast them is anything but. We're racing down a path, the flames seeming far off to our opponents, but not far enough to keep them from getting burnt. We have synergy pieces to make our fire burn hotter and our discounts dive deeper, and every one of our turns is a chance for us to flame out, or, much more reliably, to burn our opponents to the ground. The best part is how the math of this inevitability works out. Every Dragon's Approach is 3 damage, then Urabrask adds 1 to make it 4. That's perfectly divisible by a starting life total in Commander. It's like we're buying our win, a handful of damage at a time, investing our burn in this opponent or that one, and reaping dividends as our payments pile up. Our commander gives us an advance for each approach, and we put both our profits and our pings toward our final propitious purchase. In the end, the bill comes due for our opponents, and we cash our checks and smile at how cost-effective it was to win. All it took was, well, you know. You'll enjoy this deck if you love fiddly sequencing and arithmetic that adds up in your favor, or if you want a different kind of commander combo experience that means games go fast and leave you with plenty of time to play again. So as usual, this Moxfield list is linked in the video's description. At the bottom of it, you will find a considering section that has a bunch of cards that I thought about putting in or did put in and finally cut and replaced. It's a good place to start if you want to build this deck yourself, either with a bigger budget or a smaller one, and to have some ideas for how you want to get started doing that. So we're going to begin by talking about, well, Dragon's Approach. Dragon's Approach, of course, like we've already said, is 2 and a red for a sorcery that does 3 damage to each opponent, and you can have any number of copies in your deck. The only other trick to it is, as it's resolving, after it does that 3 damage, if there are 4 other copies, at least, of Dragon's Approach in our graveyard, we can exile those 4 copies and the copy that's resolving to tutor for a dragon onto the battlefield. This is pretty good, but it's sort of our plan C, you know, if we really want to have those Dragon's Approaches in our graveyard. Plan A is just to burn our opponents out and get our triggers from it, especially our trigger with our commander. Urabrask giving us that 1 bit of ping is pretty great, but that extra red mana is really where we're living. So being able to trigger Urabrask and many of our other permanents with Dragon's Approach is sort of game plan A, and part of that is a segue into plan B, which is our Past in Flames right here. We're not really in this deck focused on playing our opponent's spells. That would be kind of cool, but there are different ways to build Urabrask, and this is the way I do it with it. So we want to take our Dragon's Approaches and get them in the graveyard, either by casting them or by discarding them. There's lots of different spells we have in here that are basically a tormenting voice that lets us draw and then discard drawing and discarding a Dragon's Approach puts it in the graveyard so that we can cast it again later with our Past in Flames effect from the Great Work. Or there are a couple of other spells that will give us benefits from having them in the graveyard. And if we don't want to, we've always got the ability to take them from our graveyard and exile them rather than recasting them so that we can find ourselves a dragon. We have 2 dragons in this deck, so let's go ahead and talk about them. So we've seen our Dragon's Approach here. We're running 29 copies. I have seen some Dragon's Approach decks run 25 or 23. I've also seen people run 30 or 35 even. We are trying to be a little less focused than those hyper-focused Dragon's Approach decks, but this is still quite a few cards, quite a few copies of Dragon's Approach. So I have found that this works pretty well for us. There is one card that we will see in a moment that is an easy replace for Dragon's Approach if you want another copy, but I had 30 and I went down to 29 kind of at the 11th hour because I thought that this would be more fun. In any case, let's look at some dragons. We're running 2 of them because our big problem in this deck is running out of cards. We have a lot of spells that will put more cards on our hand, but I've chosen 2 dragons that will give us serious card advantage either immediately or over the course of the game, and both of them are good to find. We're going to start talking with Avaricious Dragon. This is a 4/4 flying dragon for 2 and double red that says at the beginning of our draw step, we draw an additional card, and at the beginning of our end step, we discard our hand. Usually, this is not a disadvantage because our hand is going to either be empty or close to empty, and so many of our cards in our graveyard can come back either with our commander or in other ways. Or they are copies of Dragon's Approach, which we have a benefit of them being in the graveyard anyway. Most importantly, though, is just the fact that at the start of our turn, we get to draw 2 cards instead of 1 every turn. So this really helps us more in the long term. However, Avaricious Dragon is, of the 2 dragons in this deck, the one we're probably going to tutor for less. We will get it if we need to tutor a second time, which usually doesn't happen because the games won't go that long. But if we've already somehow gotten our other dragon into the graveyard, or maybe it's in our hand, we can tutor for Avaricious Dragon, and it's not a bad choice to do so. What's especially nice is it costs the same as our commander, 4 mana, so that if we happen to have it in our hand early, it's not a terrible waste of our mana to cast it. The real dragon we want, though, is Nullspine Dragon. This is 5 and double red for a 7/5 flying dragon that says when it enters, we may discard our hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. So typically Nullspine Dragon, we're not going to hard cast it. We're going to tutor it out to the battlefield with Dragon's Approach. If we're doing that with Dragon's Approach, it means Dragon's Approach has resolved this turn, which means at least an opponent has taken 3 damage from the Dragon's Approach. If our commander is out face up, they've taken 4 damage, and at least one of our opponents has, because of Urabrask pinging them as well. And if we've done this after having cast multiple Dragon's Approaches, we might be drawing 6 cards, or 8 cards if we got a ping from our commander both times. In any case, Nullspine Dragon, at the very least, puts 3 cards in our hand, and sometimes that means we're up 3 cards. Even being sort of equal, if we're throwing away 3 mountains or something, giving us some gas so that we can keep burning bright is what we want. And Nullspine Dragon, it's a 7/5 flyer that blocks very well if we need to block, and it also swings in and can kill our opponents if we've gotten them down to 7 or below, which is not hard to do in this deck. So we aren't really trying to win with our dragons, but they do give us card advantage, and we're going to want that. So that is the core of our game. There's lots of ways that supplement this, but before we get into the supplementation of our game plan, we're going to look at the actual support we have for it, starting with card advantage, which is right here. I have, as usual, tagged these cards draw. That doesn't mean all these cards draw as cards. It's just the shorthand I use for card advantage in these videos. So we're going to start with one of our many Tormenting Voices. So Tormenting Voice, in case you aren't aware of it, is a card that is 1 and a red for a sorcery. As an additional cost, discard a card, draw 2 cards. So we're not running actual factual Tormenting Voice in this, but we have all of the variants on it that I thought were fit to put into the deck. Starting with Grab the Prize from Duskmourn. This is Tormenting Voice. It's 1 and a red for a sorcery. As an additional cost, discard a card and draw 2 cards. But it also says, If the discarded card wasn't a land, Grab the Prize deals 2 damage to each opponent. So this is a free extra shock to all of our opponents if we want it. And one of them, if our commander's out, it's going to be like a bolt because our commander will add that 1 damage to it. It's nice because we get to do the thing that we want to do, which is draw more cards and put cards we don't need or want in the graveyard into the graveyard. And we get a little possibility for extra damage. Now, if we're discarding a land, we throw away our mountain, this is just Tormenting Voice, and that's fine. But if it was something else, like a Dragon's Approach, we get an extra 2 damage to each opponent, and that's pretty nice. It does not target as well. That's worth noting. We're going to see in the ramp section why it's so important that this is a sorcery, and why I'm not running any Thrill of Possibilities, which of course is just the Throne of Eldraine version of Tormenting Voice that is an instant. Or Demand Answers from Murder to Karlov Manor, which is a better version of Thrill of Possibility. Anyway, next up we have Highway Robbery. This is from Thunder Junction. It's Tormenting Voice, but with 2 bonuses. So it's a sorcery for 1 and a red that says we can discard a card or sacrifice a land. And if we do, we draw 2 cards. So this is a great way for us to get a Tormenting Voice effect, to get our 2 cards of draw, and all it costs us is this card and a land we had in play that we may not need. Oftentimes we want every bit of land that we have and every bit of mana available to us. But there are sometimes we play through this and we just don't need every single land, or we don't need them as much as whatever else we have in our hand. It may also be the case that Highway Robbery is the only card we have in hand, in which case it's okay to sacrifice a land for it because otherwise we wouldn't be able to cast it at all. But it doesn't necessarily just cost 1 and a red, because it has plot. This is so cool. Plot is, for 1 and a red, we can, at sorcery speed, pay the plot cost, and exile Highway Robbery face down, and then we can cast it for free at sorcery speed on a later turn. So maybe it's turn 2 of the game, and we don't have anything else to do with our 2 mana. We could plot Highway Robbery, it'll just hang out in exile until we need to cast it. When we cast it, we do still have to pay the additional cost. Actually, it's not really an additional cost, it just reads like one. So the way this works is we can cast Highway Robbery either for its regular mana cost or for free because we've plotted it, and then we've just cast it. At that point, when it resolves, it gives us the option to discard a card or sacrifice a land. If we don't, it will resolve and nothing happens. If we do, we draw 2 cards. So Highway Robbery, because of the way it's worded and because of plot, technically we can use it as a ritual. We can pay 2 to plot it. Then on a later turn when our commander's out, we can cast it, discard no cards and sacrifice no lands, and it won't do anything other than trigger our commander, which will ping someone for 1 and make a single red mana, which can get things started for us. That's a strange mode to use, but we can do that, and it's nice with Highway Robbery in our opening hand if we just plot it out. However, if we do decide to discard a card or sacrifice a land when we cast it, of course we draw 2 cards, and that gets our engine fueled up a little more. From Wilds of Eldraine, it is another Tormenting Voice. This is Witch's Mark. It's 1 and a red for a sorcery. It says you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. This is, again, worded unlike Tormenting Voice. So Grab the Prize is wording like Tormenting Voice as an additional cost. As an additional cost, you have to discard a card. So you can't even cast it if you aren't willing to discard a card. With Highway Robbery, you can cast it, and discarding a card or sacrificing a land is part of the resolution. The same is true of Witch's Mark. You can cast it, and when it resolves, you may discard a card, and if you do, draw 2 cards. So if you don't discard a card, you won't draw, but it will still resolve, and it does something else as well, which is it creates a Wicked Roll token attached to up to 1 creature you control. A Wicked Roll is an aura that, of course, enchants a creature. It gives that enchanted creature +1/+1, and it says when that aura is put into a graveyard, each opponent loses a life. So this is a little bit more burn in a way, if we are able to have that roll come off of our commander. The easy way, it seems like, for that to happen is for our commander to die. Then the roll goes to the graveyard. When it's put into the graveyard, each opponent loses a life, even though as a token, that roll just sort of disappears. However, there have been plenty of times that I've seen Witch's Mark resolve, put a Wicked Roll on our commander, and then we recast Witch's Mark from the graveyard using a different version of Past in Flames, which we will see later on in this. So being able to recast this from our graveyard, a creature can only have a single roll token attached to it. So if we put a second Wicked Roll on it, then one of them will go to the graveyard, and that will trigger its when it goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses a life trigger. So all that to say, for 1 and a red, we can make our commander have +1/+1, and when that token goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses a life. That will happen whether or not we decide to discard a card, and we do not have to discard a card as part of the cost of Witch's Mark. So, but of course we usually want to. As long as we have a card to discard, we want to get rid of it, because it's, no matter what we have in hand, whatever 2 cards are next are better. 2 birds in the bush are better than 1 in the hand? Maybe not true. Anyway, so Galvanic Relay is next. This is 2 and a red for a sorcery. This is Impulse Draw rather than the typical kind of draw we've seen from the Tormenting Voice variants. So it says, exile the top card of your library. During your next turn, you may play that card. That means you cannot play them this turn, but you can play them during your next turn. And that's just 1 card, except that Galvanic Relay has Storm, which is great for this deck. Storm means whenever we cast this, we count the number of spells that have been cast before it. That's our spells and anyone else's spells. If an opponent tried to kill one of our other opponent's creatures on this turn, that counts as a spell being cast. So if we've cast, let's just make it simple, if if the person piloting this deck has cast 2 spells before they cast Galvanic Relay, Storm will trigger when we cast it, and it will make 2 copies of it on the stack. And essentially what that means is we will exile 3 cards, and during our next turn, we can cast those 3 cards. So nice with Galvanic Relay. Sad if we lose some mountains that we might have wanted, but that's how it goes. Next is Light Up the Stage. So much fun, and really fun in this deck. 2 and a red for a sorcery that says exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. So that means means if we exile mountains, we can play them as our land drops. And this lasts during the current turn and until the end of our next turn. So lots of time to be able to use these 2 cards that we exiled. But Light Up the Stage also has Spectacle for a single red, which means rather than paying 2 and a red for it, we can, again at sorcery speed, cast it for just a single red as long as an opponent has lost life this turn. Pretty likely that we're going to be able to make that happen. The one thing I do want to mention is we cannot cast it for its Spectacle cost, triggering our commander, pinging someone for 1, and now it qualifies for the Spectacle cost. They have to have lost the life before we even put Light Up the Stage on the stack. So we're going to have to pay for it with its full cost if no one's lost life already this turn. But if we cast any one of our other instants or sorceries, and our commander's out, we can ping someone, and now they have lost life, and we can cast Light Up the Stage for its Spectacle cost. Pretty fun. Also worth remembering that when our commander pings someone, we make a red mana. So we might, let's say we cast Galvanic Relay, our commander pinged someone, we made a red, now we can cast Light Up the Stage essentially for free, because we can use the red that our commander made to pay the Spectacle cost. And then that will trigger our commander again, and we'll replace that red in our mana pool. So pretty nice. Next we have Seize the Spoils. It is another one of the sorcery speed Tormenting Voice variants, but this is one that makes mana for us as well. For 2 and a red, we have a sorcery that as an additional cost, we have to discard a card, but then it draws us 2 cards and makes a treasure token. So this is just Tormenting Voice that costs 1 more and then gives it back to us in the form of treasure. So we have to invest a little bit more, but we get our money right back, essentially, our mana right back. And we get to hold on to it until we need it later, which we might when we get our 3rd chapter of the backside of our commander resolving. Next is Wheel of Misfortune. This card is really great in this deck, but it does read like it's crazy. So for 2 and a red, we have a sorcery that says each player secretly chooses a number, 0 or greater. Then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest numbers revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number. and each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So what this means is, if everyone, let's say in a scenario, everyone chooses the same number, everyone chooses 3. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number, which is 3, since all of them are 3, to each player that chose that number. That's everyone. Everyone's going to take 3 damage. And then each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand. Everyone in this case chose the lowest number. So no one discards their hand and draws 7 cards. What if we had our players choose 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 0, 1, 2, 3, let's say. So Wheel of Misfortune will deal damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose it, which is the person who chose 3, so that person will take 3 damage. And then each player who didn't choose the lowest number, which is the person who chose 0, will discard their hand and draw 7. So in that case, there are 3 kinds of people. The person who chose 0, to whom nothing happens. The person who chose 3, who took 3 damage. And the people who chose 1, 2, and 3, who all discard their hand and draw 7 cards. Because the first sentence asks who did a thing. The second sentence asks who didn't do a thing. So remember, the person who, if someone's taking damage, they are also wheeling their hand. The only time that wouldn't be the case is if every player chose the same number. So anyway, Wheel of Misfortune is not that difficult. People make it out to be like it's a complicated, spell. But ultimately, it just means, did people all choose the same number? If not, someone's going to take damage, and that person's going to wheel, as is everyone else who didn't choose the lowest number. That's all it is. This is great because it lets us draw 7 cards. And it doesn't matter if we take damage. It's fine to cast Wheel of Misfortune in this deck and say, I'm choosing 10. Obviously you don't say it out loud until it's time to reveal. It's unlikely that someone's going to wager, a quarter of their starting life total to be able to wheel. But that just ensures that you're going to be one of the people that gets to do the wheeling, gets to discard your hand and draw 7. Those cards are much more powerful in our hand than they are in anyone else's, probably. So being able to just throw away a bunch of life, we might, of our 3 cards in there, or 3 of our 7 cards might just be Dragon's Approaches. So that's 9 damage to all of our opponents anyway. And if we have 3 opponents, what's that, 27 damage? That's a lot more than the 10 we took for it. Plus we've got 4 more cards left in our hand. Anyway, I think Wheel of Misfortune is really cool. It's a fun card. It comes up at tables and people get excited, maybe in not a positive way all the time, but anyway, it's a good time. And it's good in this deck. Next up, Ashling does so much. From Modern Horizons 3, Ashling Flame Dancer is 2 and a double red for a 4/4 legendary elemental shaman. Totally worth building a deck out of Ashling. Ashling says, you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. That means, while Ashling is in play, anytime you tap for red or add red to your pool, like from our commander's triggered ability, it doesn't go away until we spend it, as long as we continue to control Ashling. So if there are plenty of times where we have enough mana to cast a final spell in our turn, and it triggers Urabrask, he pings someone, he adds one to our mana pool, and we don't really have a way to spend that last one. With Ashling out, it'll stick around, and we can cast it, or use it to cast things on our opponent's turns, if we have instant speed things, or put it into abilities, if we have an ability to pay into, or just keep it until our next turn. It's pretty nice, and it's just very powerful on its own. But what we care about more in this deck is Ashling's Magecraft ability. Magecraft is an ability that triggers whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery. If we're casting or copying a spell, and that spell is an instant or a sorcery, Magecraft triggers. So this is great. It's a Strixhaven thing, which fits the Dragon's Approach deck. But let's talk about how Ashling's Magecraft trigger works. All it is discard a card, then draw a card. It is not the same as discard a card, and if you do, draw a card. This means if we have cards in our hand, we got to put one of them on our graveyard. Then we'll take one from our library and put it in our hand. If we don't have cards in our hand, this tries to do everything it can, which is to say, when we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, we will discard nothing because we have nothing in our hand, and then we will draw a card. So we do get that draw even if we had nothing in our hand when the Magecraft trigger resolves. So all that happens every time we cast or copy an instant or sorcery. Additionally, if this is the second time that this ability resolves this turn, Ashling deals 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. So this is a very light board wipe for all the creatures that had only 2 toughness, or, had only needed 2 more damage marked on them in order to die. Plus, it's 2 damage to each opponent, which is twice as good as what our commander does. If our commander's out at the same time, this is the second time we've cast or copied an instant or sorcery, so we've probably also triggered Urabrask twice. So this is doubling up on the damage Urabrask's already done to one opponent, and it's to all of our opponents. But remember, this is if this is the second time the ability is resolved this turn. That means we have gotten our rummage, our discard and draw, twice already. And if it happens to trigger a third time, we will add 4 red mana. Now, if it triggers a third time, this second part doesn't happen again, because that only happens the second time it's resolved. This last one only happens the third time it resolves. This first one happens every time it resolves. So we're only going to get the 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control once each turn. And the 4 red mana will only get once each turn. But the rummage, the discard and draw, we'll get that every time Ashling triggers. So Ashling is doing a lot for us here. Really great addition to the deck. And even just the first ability is great. And it's a 4/4. Come on, 4/4 for 4. We love her. Or him? I don't really know Ashling's pronouns, but I like Ashling. We've seen Avaricious Dragon. Gives us card advantage in the form of drawing extra card during our draw step. Pirate's Pillage is next. Pirate's Pillage is just an upgraded Seize the Spoils. Upgraded in the sense that it costs more, but it does more. For 3 and a red, it's a sorcery that says as an additional cost, discard a card, and then draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. It's just Tormenting Voice, costs 2 more, and it takes that 2 and transforms them into treasures. The same way that Seize the Spoils is Tormenting Voice that costs 1 more and turns that 1 into a treasure. So same idea, very good from original Ixalan. Next is Will of the Jeskai. Will of the Jeskai, this is our other Past in Flames. It's 3 and a red for a sorcery that says choose 1, and if you control a commander as you cast this spell, you may choose both instead. That means if we cast Will of the Jeskai, and in response to it, somebody kills our Urabrask, we still get to choose both, because it was as it was cast. The way it works is, we get to choose to either have everyone discard their hand and draw 5, which is something we will almost always do. But we can also have the Past in Flames effect. Each instant and sorcery in our graveyard gains flashback until end of turn with a flashback cost equal to its mana cost. That's the same thing as our commander's Backside's 3rd chapter ability, except that we can't cast spells from our opponent's graveyards. We could run actual Past in Flames, but I thought Will of the Jeskai was more fun, because Past in Flames, it costs the same amount, and it only lets us do this, but it has its own flashback cost of 4 and a red. I thought it would be more powerful if we have the option to, instead of Past in Flamesing, discard our hand and draw 5, or if we have our commander out, to do both. So Will of the Jeskai is my pick for this as a sort of backup to our commander's final ability. If our commander is face up, and we're trying to get him to flip, and someone tries to remove him, or someone looks like they're going to be able to remove him, obviously this is a sorcery, so we can only do it at sorcery speed, we can always use this as a nice backup to that. Or maybe our opponents are just in a low life total and we have plenty of Dragon's Approaches in our graveyard. We cast Will of the Jeskai, we can discard our hand, maybe that even puts more Dragon's Approaches in our graveyard. Draw 5, maybe that puts more in our hand. And then we can do this. Now this is a little different in analysis from the way our commander's ability works. This actually gives each instant and sorcery in our graveyard flashback. That means any instants and sorceries that enter our graveyard after Will of the Jeskai has resolved do not have flashback. That is different from the way that Urabrask works, because Urabrask says until the end of turn, we may cast instant sorcery spells from any graveyard. So we could cast Dragon's Approach, have it go to the graveyard, and on this same turn, recast that Dragon's Approach because this is giving us permission rather than giving those spells flashback. As opposed to Will of the Jeskai, which just gives the spells flashback. So a little bit different in the way that it works, but it usually works out to be the same. It's just a difference of if we were to, draw a copy of Dragon's Approach and then cast it, it would go to the graveyard, and with Will of the Jeskai having already been cast, that copy of Dragon's Approach wouldn't be able to be flashed back. But if we had the third chapter ability of the back of our commander resolve, we could cast Dragon's Approach, have it go to the graveyard, cast it again from the graveyard, and it would exile itself. So yeah, that's how it works. Finally, we've seen Nullspine Dragon. It's our best dragon hit. It lets us discard our whole hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to an opponent this turn. So that is our section for card advantage. Let's take a look at our acceleration section. This is pretty fun. So we get to do fun, weird cards in this deck, like Locket of Yesterdays. For a single mana, generic mana, we have an artifact that makes the spells we cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast for each card with the same name as that spell in our graveyard. That means, in this deck, it means while this is in play, if we have any Dragon's Approaches in our graveyard, each Dragon's Approach we then cast costs 1 less. That counts if we're flashing a spell back, or if we're casting it from the graveyard with the third chapter ability of the Great Work. It does require a spell to be in the graveyard, though. So if we only have 1 copy of Dragon's Approach in our graveyard, and we cast it, it doesn't cost less to cast for itself being in the graveyard because it is no longer in the graveyard when we are casting it. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know in the comments below. I believe that you have to move it to the stack in order to calculate its cost. That's the first step of casting a spell before you even calculate, so it's no longer in the graveyard. But if someone knows some kind of other fiddly way of interpreting the rules, let me know. Locket of Yesterdays is a pretty good hit for us in this deck. Not as good as some of our other ones, but it is the cheapest. So everyone knows Sol Ring. Sol Ring costs 1 and it taps for 2 colorless. We want it in our deck, especially a deck like this, which even though it requires a lot of red mana, our commander's making a lot of red mana. So we're not usually in a situation where Sol Ring doesn't do much for us. There are certainly times, however, where we tap Sol Ring and we only need one of these to use on one spell, and we just sort of float the other one for the next spell. Strike It Rich, oh, so good in this deck. Single red for a sorcery that says just make a treasure token. That's all it does. It turns 1 red mana into a treasure, and we can flash it back for 2 in a red and make another treasure. What's great about this card is that with our commander out, we pay a red, we make a treasure, and our commander pings someone and makes another red. So we've just cast it for free. That red mana is we've got that red mana in our pool still. So we can turn 1 red sort of into 2 by saying cast this, make a treasure, and our commander makes a red. Now we use that red and a treasure into 2. So it's like a little baby ritual in that way in our deck. And if we want to cast this from the graveyard, we can flash it back. Or if our commander has, if the backside of our commander's third chapter ability has triggered, we can just cast this from our graveyard and then exile it in the process, which means we don't have to use the flashback cost. We can do it for just the regular red. So imagine that third chapter ability has triggered. Strike It Rich is in our hand. We cast Strike It Rich for 1 red. Our commander, since they're back on the front side, makes a red and pings someone. Strike It Rich goes to the graveyard. We then use that permission to cast it from the graveyard for the red that's floating. We float another red from our commander, ping someone again, and make a second treasure. Now we have 1 red floating and 2 treasures. Strike It Rich is in the exile zone. We've pinged someone twice, or 2 people once. It seems really fun. It's just fun to go off this way. Our storm count has risen, Arcane Signet is a 2 mana rock. Costs 2, it's an artifact, taps for red in this commander deck. So it's just an untapped source of red mana. That's pretty good. Fire Diamond and Cold Steel Heart are the same thing, but they come in tapped. So Fire Diamond costs 2, enters tapped, makes red. That's all we want from it. Just redundancy. Cold Steel Heart costs 2, comes in tapped. As it comes in, we choose a color. We will choose red, and we can make a mana of that chosen color. I guess we could choose another color if it looks like our opponents are all playing green or black or whatever, and we want to make mana of that color so that when the Great Works 3rd chapter ability goes off, we can use Cold Steel Heart to make the color of the spells in their graveyard that we're casting. But we're making so much treasure in this deck, I don't think that's worth it. It's better to just have access to red mana as much as we can. Next is Ruby Medallion, which is a little expensive for this kind of deck, but really great in ours. It's another 2-mana rock, but instead of tapping for mana, this artifact makes our red spells cost 1 generic mana less to cast, which can take all of our Dragon's Approaches and make them cost just 1 and a red. That's pretty good. You know, that's exactly what Locket of Yesterdays is doing if we have a Dragon's Approach in the graveyard when we cast one. But Ruby Medallion does this for all of our red spells, including our commander. Next we have Cloud Key, which is 3 mana for an artifact that says, as it enters, we choose artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery, and spells we cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. In this deck, we want to choose sorcery, because sorceries are what we are primarily casting. We are running 41 of them in this deck. And by doing this, it makes all of our Dragon's Approaches cost 1 less. All of our Tormenting Voice variants cost 1 less. So many good things for us, and going from 3 mana to 2 is a pretty big change. Going from 2 mana to 1 is an enormous one. So if we have this on top of, let's say, Ruby Medallion or Locket of Yesterdays, Cloud Key is going to give us so much mana advantage over the course of the game, it's absolutely worth running for that just for sorceries. We've seen Seize the Spoils, and how it's a Tormenting Voice that can give us a treasure. Pirate's Pillage does the same thing, but let's talk about Semblance Anvil. Semblance Anvil is a better effect, but it has a little bit more cost than Cloud Key. So Semblance Anvil is a 3-mana artifact with imprint. It says when it enters, we have to exile a non-land card from our hand. We don't have to, I guess. We may, but we ought to. Spells that we cast that share a card type with the exiled card cost 2 generic mana less to cast. So, much like I mentioned earlier, it is fine when we are having to discard cards for a Tormenting Voice effect. If we want to throw our Dragon's Approaches in the graveyard, that's okay. We've got benefits from that. If we have Dragon's Approach in our hand when we cast Semblance Anvil, and when it enters, it's totally fine to exile one of those. We're running 29 copies. We're going to see more of them. The trade-off of losing that Dragon's Approach is that while Semblance Anvil is in play, all of our Dragon's Approaches cost a single red mana, which is to say, with our commander, making a mana every time we cast one, after the first one, they're all free. It's crazy powerful, very, very strong for us. For the cards that we might cast, like Will of the Jeskai, that's also a sorcery. If we've exiled a sorcery with Semblance Anvil, that costs 1 and a red. And if we have Cloud Key out with Sorcery Chosen and Ruby Medallion, it costs 1 generic mana. Or one red mana, I should say. So Semblance Anvil, very, very powerful. Even more powerful than Cloud Key, but it requires us to throw away one of our sorceries, which isn't really much of an ask in this deck. Anyway, very nice discounts here. And these 4 cards that discount our spells on top of our commander being able to continually produce red mana is what lets us storm off so well. Speaking of storm, we finally have Stormkiln Artist. This is another Strixhaven card. It's a 2/2 Dwarf Shaman for 3 and a red that gets +1/+1 for each artifact we control. This is fine, but isn't relevant in this deck. Just keep in mind that the treasures we make a lot of, especially with the 2nd chapter ability of the Great Work, are artifacts, so they count toward this. As are the treasures that Stormkiln Artist makes themselves, because they have Magecraft. Whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, we make a treasure. This is fantastic in our deck. Just being able to constantly make more treasures every time we're casting our many, many sorceries, and our few instants, I suppose. It's like doubling up on the trigger that our commander gives us. Not in the sense of the ping that he has, but in the sense of the red mana we're getting. But these treasures last longer. So Stormkiln Artist is 4 mana, which is kind of expensive in our deck as an investment after we get our commander onto the battlefield. But it's a way for us to catch back up later if we end up behind. Maybe someone removes Urabrask or something. And it's a great way for us to, if we can get it out, before we flip Urabrask, or in the process of flipping Urabrask, we can do so much with it. I mentioned before that Urabrask's second chapter ability as the Great Work is a setup time. What I've seen this work as is we flip it, and then that same turn that we've cast a bunch of spells and hurt people, we flip it, we do some damage to someone, that's fine. The next turn, we're making 3 treasures. We don't want to spend those treasures if we can help it. What we want to do is take a moment to set up for our next turn. Because remember, when Urabrask is face up, we're triggering his triggered ability and doing damage and making mana. That will be the same turn that he flips over into this, but once he's flipped into the Great Work, we don't get that trigger anymore. So if we're casting spells after he's flipped onto the first chapter ability or the second turn, we're not getting any of these great pings and this extra mana. So we use this turn as sort of a break to set up. Casting Stormkiln Artist during that turn is a great use of that time because it means that on the next turn, we're going to get this trigger, which includes Urabrask flipping back over, and now anything we cast, whether it's from our hand or from our graveyard, or I guess someone else's graveyard, we're going to be able to get triggers from the front side of our commander and Stormkiln Artist. So being able to get extra treasures then, really, really nice, especially if we, like I said, used our setup moment during that second chapter of the Great Work to actually set up for it with Stormkiln Artist. That covers our acceleration. Let's take a look at interaction, which again, I've just sort of shorthanded as removal here. I know I said 10 pieces of interaction. It would be great if I had that. It would be great if I could fit more into here. And if you want to take out some of the Dragon's Approach copies in this, if you think that would be helpful, go for it. I wanted to add just a few pieces of removal of interaction in this section to deal with things in case our game goes a little too long and in case things get too hairy. But for the most part, we just don't need it in this deck. We can kind of ignore our opponents and burn them out before we get bothered by anything of theirs. So let's talk about what we're actually running in this section. We're running Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt goes in every red deck, so it's in every red deck. You don't have to run the Mystical Archive printing, but it's a Dragon's Approach deck, and this is from Strixhaven, so also it's my favorite printing of Lightning Bolt. Maybe not my favorite, but I do love it. Anyway, it's a single red for an instant that deals 3 damage to any target. That's Lightning Bolt. It's great. You can hit opponents with this, you can hit their planeswalkers, you can hit their creatures. It's in this section because it can hit creatures, so you want to kill something, go for it. You know, this is a great way to take the backside of Urabrask, which does 3 damage to each creature that an opponent controls, and make that 3 damage into 6. Make it so any creature it didn't kill, it probably has, with just an extra casting of Lightning Bolt. Even better, for you to cast Lightning Bolt before you flip Urabrask, mark that damage on a creature, then use the 1 red mana that Urabrask produced when you cast Lightning Bolt to flip Urabrask, and now 3 damage to each of those creatures, and it kills the one that you hit with Lightning Bolt. Next is Shattering Spree. Kind of a strange inclusion in this deck, but I've got a reason for it. Shattering Spree is a single red for a sorcery with Replicate for 1 red. It destroys an artifact. And if we replicate it, we make a copy of it for every time we pay the replicate cost. We can choose new targets, and we can pay that cost as many times as we want. So for every red we put into this, we're blowing up an artifact. That's fine. It's Shatter. It's okay. It's sorcery speed. It's a single red, so we get a rebate for that with our commander out. That's fine. What's great about Shattering Spree, though, is not just that it gives us a way to just deal with artifacts in the cheapest way possible, 1 mana per artifact, but also it's a sorcery. So while its replicate cost is colored mana, and it only costs a single red mana in its casting cost, that means we can't discount it. In any of our mana discounts, even just having all of our red spells discounted, it doesn't discount Shattering Spree because all of those discounts are in the form of colorless mana. However, we can imprint this to Semblance Anvil because this is a sorcery. So the expectation that we're going to need this for artifacts is pretty low. So if we get Semblance Anvil in hand when we have Shattering Spree in hand, we just exile this under Semblance Anvil, and we don't have to use up one of our Dragon's Approaches for it. And now, Shattering Spree has turned our Dragon's Approaches into 1-mana spells. Anyway, very flexible with the replicate cost. I just think it's a cool card, and it's good in this deck for a number of reasons. Better than a Braid, because, like I said, the difference between 2 and 3 mana is a lot. The difference between 1 and 2 is a huge amount. So next is Captain Ripley Vance. Really fun in this deck. Captain Ripley Vance is a 3/2 legendary human pirate for 2 and a red that says when we cast our 3rd spell each turn, we put a 1/1 counter on Captain Ripley Vance, and then it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So the first time this happens, it's going to do 4 damage, because the 1/1 counter on a 3/2. It requires us to cast our 3rd spell. And because so much of our deck is played at sorcery speed, that means it's only going to happen once per turn, and only once on our turns, probably. But when it happens, we're doing at least 4 damage to something. We can hit an opponent, maybe this kills them or gets them close to being killed. We can hit a creature, maybe it kills that creature, or like I was mentioning with Lightning Bolt, gets them close enough to being killed once we flip Urabrask. Because in all likelihood, if we've cast our 3rd spell, that 3rd spell was probably an instant or sorcery in our deck, which means we have a red mana in our pool that we can use to then flip Urabrask, since it's our 3rd instant or sorcery probably. And we get to do that 3 damage to an opponent and to each of their creatures. So even with Captain Ripley Vance being in play and it happens the next turn, and it's the first counter that the captain has gotten, that's 4 damage, plus the 3 from our commander, that's 7 damage. So anything with 7 toughness without indestructible goes away. Seems good. Captain Ripley Vance, I do want to mention, does count itself. So if we cast the captain and then cast 2 more spells, we have cast our 3rd spell. So the captain would trigger, get a counter, and do damage to something. If our captain is our 3rd spell, however, it will not be in play when it would trigger, so it can't trigger while it's on the stack. So if you're casting Captain Ripley Vance and you wanted to multi-spell during your turn, make sure, if you can, that the captain happens before your 3rd spell, that it isn't your 3rd spell for the turn, so you can get the value out of it. Last note, what in the world is going on in this art? Why are there so many cannons? I hope this is an artistic render, because this is a bad place to be with your head right by this cannon. Next up is Chaos Warp. I don't usually put Chaos Warp in my decks, but it's just a solid way of dealing with anything. It's a color pie break for that reason. So 2 and a red for an instant, it says the owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent, they put it on the battlefield. So we can get rid of a land with this. We can get rid of a commander with this. We can get rid of anything we want that's a permanent. And then it's possible that our opponent will get something even better, or they might just get a tap land. You know, this is a way of dealing with basically anything and at instant speed. I tried to find a really good sorcery speed Chaos Warp, and original Chaos Warp is just the best. That's why they don't print things like this that much anymore. But yeah, very nice. The one thing I will mention is I just said that you can get rid of someone's commander with this. When you tuck their commander into their library, technically they can redirect it and put it in the command zone. That's fine. And they will still get to flip a card, or flip the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent, put it on the battlefield. That's just how commanders work. But yeah, Chaos Warp is sort of our answer to anything we need to answer. But we also have Guffer Writes History, which is a little like Chaos Warp for everyone. Really fun card, and really, I like Commodore Guff. He's a really stupid character in the story, but I just really like that he exists. Anyway, the way this works is it's a 2 and a red instant that says for each player, choose target non-enchantment, non-land permanent that player controls. So we can't hit enchantments, we can't hit lands. We can hit planeswalkers and creatures and battles and artifacts. Those permanents' owners shuffle them into their libraries. Each player who controlled one of those permanents exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, then puts the rest on the bottom in a random order, and each player may cast the non-land card they exiled without paying its mana cost. So, in a way, this is a worse version, worse for us, of Chaos Warp. It can't hit enchantments or lands, which that's fine about lands, too bad about enchantments. but it can hit any other permanent, and it works for each player, which includes us. So we get to put something back in our library and find something else. We can't hit a land with it. We probably don't want to hit our commander with it, but we can sure hit one of those treasure tokens with it. We go until we find a non-land, and then we can cast it for free. That seems pretty good. Going through our deck to find a non-land, that will most likely hit a Dragon's Approach. Which means this is like the only way in the deck we can cast Dragon's Approach on someone else's turn. Which may be fun for us, who knows. That's one of the reasons, even though Guffer Writes History is an instant, I like to play it at sorcery speed. So these are all we have in the way of interaction. We are here to interact using our commander, and a lot of the burn spells we're interacting with our opponents, not really to get rid of people's permanents ourselves. So that's what we've got. So let's take a look now at the supplemental categories, starting with our burn category. We have a few things we've seen here already, but a few we haven't, or one we haven't, two we haven't. We're going to start with Bolt Wave. I mentioned before, we're running 29 Dragon's Approaches. Bolt Wave is the reason we're not running 30, because Bolt Wave is a sorcery for 1 red that deals 3 damage to each opponent. It's exactly the same as Dragon's Approach, except it doesn't have any of this other malarkey in it, and it costs just 1 red. Bolt Wave, as a way to just guarantee 3 damage to each opponent for 1 red, without having to worry about discounts, without having to worry about anything else. I just think it feeds into the game plan that we're going for. We're trying to burn our opponents out, so this is the way to do it. So I think this addition with Foundations is really cool. Yeah, it would be a great choice to replace with another one of our Dragon's Approaches if you really want to, but I think it's great on its own, and it really helps supplement our approaches game plan. So we've seen Lightning Bolt. It can go face, so it can burn our players out. I should mention, this burn section means we're burning players. The interaction section was about creatures and other things. Grab the Prize. When we discard a card to cast it, if we discard a non-land, 2 damage to each opponent. Captain Ridley Vance can go face with their triggered ability, so that's nice. Gutter Snipe. I thought about a lot of different other creatures that can ping someone, but Gutter Snipe is the only one I went with, just because it does the most damage, and it's sort of the most classic to me. For 2 and a red, we have a 2/2 Goblin Shaman that says whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, this creature deals 2 damage to each opponent. It's each opponent, it's 2 damage, it's twice as good as what our commander is doing, and it's to every opponent. It's not Bolt Wave, because it's 2 damage versus 3, but it's pretty close, and we can get it to happen multiple times. And it does turn Bolt Wave into 5 damage. It turns Dragon's Approach into 5 damage. We may have a few of those triggering in our deck. Gutter Snipe is the Stormkiln Artist, is a great spell to cast during the setup time of Chapter 2 of the Great Work. If we don't already have it out, we want it out. Wheel of Misfortune, of course, can burn a player who chooses the highest number. As long as we didn't choose the lowest number, that's fine. It doesn't matter if it's us. And of course, Ashling, when we trigger Ashling's Magecraft ability the second time each turn, Ashling will do 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. So we've seen all of this damage that we're doing. Let's see how we get a little bit more of it. Mechanized Warfare is 1 and double red for an enchantment from Brothers War that says if a red or artifact source we control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. So this is just 3 mana to sit on the battlefield and wait for us to trigger our commander. Wait for us to cast Dragon's Approach. Wait for us to trigger our Gutter Snipe. It adds 1 damage to any amount of damage we would be doing. What's great about this is, if we have our commander out and Mechanized Warfare out, and we cast Dragon's Approach, our commander will trigger and should do 1 damage to 1 person, but because of Mechanized Warfare, they'll do 2 damage. Then Dragon's Approach will trigger, and it should do 3 damage to everyone, but because of Mechanized Warfare, it will do 4 damage to everyone. So one of our opponents has taken 6 damage from that. And they will probably continue to every time we cast another Dragon's Approach. We can spread that around, but I want to be clear that Mechanized Warfare doesn't add 1 to the total, it adds 1 to each event. And our commander is one event, and Dragon's Approach itself is a single event. The same is true of Torbrand, Thane of Redfell from Throne of Eltraine, my favorite set. For 1 and triple red, we get a 2/4 legendary Dwarf Noble that says if a red source we control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. So Torbrand is doing 2 extra damage on top of the 1 extra damage that Mechanized Warfare, would be doing. If we have both out, it's not like they are doubling effects. So it'll just be each time we would do damage, one of our red sources would do damage, it'll be doing plus 3 damage. So these are pretty simple in terms of the math of it. We're just adding extra damage to each event. But Torbrand, like Gutter Snipe, is making our Dragon's Approaches do 5 damage. If we had Gutter Snipe out, Torbrand would add 2 to the Gutter Snipe and 2 to the Dragon's Approach for a total of 9 damage for every time we cast Dragon's Approach. Just very nice. And again, both of these, like Gutter Snipe, like Stormkiln Artist, are great things for us to do during that second chapter setup moment for our commander. So that covers our extra damage section. I have a section called Magecraft. Not everything in this section has actual Magecraft. Stormkiln Artist and Ashling do. I just tagged it this way to indicate these are cards that trigger when we cast instants and sorceries. It's just that things with actual Magecraft also would trigger when we would copy something, which there's only one way to do in this deck, and that is Pyromancer Ascension, a card you don't really get to play in Commander. For 1 and a red, this is an enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery that has the same name as a card in your graveyard, you may put a quest counter on this enchantment. So this is only really going to happen if we cast Dragon's Approach when we already have a copy of Dragon's Approach in our graveyard, much like we saw earlier. But if that's the case, and it's pretty likely to be the case, when we have Pyromancer Ascension out, which again is only 2 mana, we get a quest counter on it. And then, from then on, whenever we cast an instant or sorcery while this enchantment has 2 or more quest counters on it, we may copy the spell we cast and we can choose new targets for the copy. So all we have to do is get a copy of Dragon's Approach into our graveyard, get Pyromancer Ascension onto the battlefield, and cast Dragon's Approach twice. Which is not hard to do if we're able to Past in Flames all our Dragon's Approaches in our graveyard using the backside of our commander. As long as we leave 1 in our graveyard when both of those other 2 have resolved, whether we cast them from our hand or from our graveyard, Pyromancer Ascension is going to get 2 quest counters, and once it does, from then on, all of our instants and sorceries, we can copy them. We can cast a Dragon's Approach and get 2 of them. We can cast a Lightning Bolt and get 2 of them. We can cast one of our Tormenting Voices, like Grab the Prize, and get 2 of them. Pyromancer Ascension is a great way for us to just, to go crazy with this, and kind of better than even like Mechanized Warfare and Torbrand in that way, because we're just getting so many more triggers. In addition, when we make those copies, if Ashling or Stormkiln Artist are in play, they will trigger as well, because Magecraft cares about casting or copying instants and sorceries. So I know it seems like a small section, and it is, just like the extra damage section is small. As I mentioned at the top of the video, or the top of going through the cards of the video, all of my decks have a considering section at the bottom, and the considering section definitely has more things in the Magecraft category, as it will in most of these categories. Speaking of categories, let's talk about our graveyard category. This is relevant in some ways. There are some cards in the considering section that really care more about it, but what we really care about is this is a section that asks us, how do we get more of our Dragon's Approaches into the graveyard? Usually we want to cast them, if we can, but if we're really trying to fill up our graveyard with them, either because we want to go find a dragon, or more likely, because we want to be able to cast them from our graveyard using one of our Past in Flames effects, being able to put them in our graveyard is a good way to do that if we can't otherwise cast them, or if it would be more advantageous to us to put them in the graveyard rather than cast them. So for example, our tormenting voices here, grab the prize, highway robbery, witch's mark, seize the spoils, pirate's pillage, all of these ask us or require us to put a card in our graveyard. That's why they're here. Sometimes it's better to spend our 3 mana to seize the spoils than it is to Dragon's Approach. We put the Dragon's Approach from our hand into the graveyard, and we end up with 2 other cards and a treasure on top of it. We can get that Dragon's Approach back later in several different ways. The same is true of Wheel of Misfortune, which has us discard our hand and draw 7, assuming we didn't choose the lowest number. Ashling lets us discard a card and draw a card. That puts things in the graveyard. Will of the Jeskai, of course, and Nullspine Dragon as well, both ask us to discard our hand and then draw 5 cards, or for the dragon, an amount of cards equal to the amount of damage that target opponent was dealt this turn. So lots of ways for us to get things into the graveyard. Next, we have a recursion section, which is just Will of the Jeskai. It's recursive in the sense that it has a Past in Flames effect on it. There are other ways of recurring things, as you will see in the considering section, but it's the only one that fit this section that I kept in the deck. We also have a synergy section. This section is synergistic in the sense that, oh goodness, Light Up the Stage cares about our opponents losing life. That's what we're trying to do in this deck, so it synergizes with that. The same is true of Nullspine Dragon. It synergizes with our opponents having been dealt damage because that's how many cards it gets to draw for us. This kind of synergy notation, not super relevant in this deck, but it's definitely in the considering section as well. I encourage you to check it out. Finally, I've saved it for now because it's right by the synergy section. Ashling is our Wrath. Ashling can only do 2 damage to our opponents and each creature they control if we've triggered their Magecraft trigger twice in a turn. But our commander also has a Wrath on the back. All we have to do is cast 3 instants or sorceries, pay a red, flip our commander, and there we do have 3 damage to each of the creatures an opponent controls. So, yeah, we're really trying to run faster than our opponents in this deck than we are to Wrath things, but we do have some board wipe effects that might prove useful to us. So that covers all the spells in our deck. As usual, we're going to go over our lands now, and it's very simple in this deck. We're running 34 of our 38 lands as just basic mountains. We want to make sure we hit our land drops. That's why I always run, or almost always run, 38 lands in our deck. It still works with this deck. I know sometimes you want to be able to say, I'm running 33 lands because I'm mono red. I want to be able to make sure I get other things in my hand. I have found in my testing that it's fine. We hate stumbling on mana in this deck because we're so mana intensive with our spells. So having enough basic mountains and just cards in general really is helpful to us. I know that it seems like Temple of the False God wouldn't fit in it, therefore. But it's fine. We're running a $112 deck. This is not a super powerful deck that needs an Ancient Tomb or some kind of other game changer. Temple of the False God is fine, especially with the amount of cards we're drawing and the number of turns we're taking, since Urabrask usually doesn't come out until turn 4, sometimes a little earlier, depending on what kind of ramp we can do. But if Urabrask coming out on turn 4, we haven't played Temple of the False God before then. Oh, I guess I should read the land. This is a land that comes in untapped and taps for 2 colorless mana. So it's a soul land, like Soul Ring, except that you can only activate it if you have 4 other lands in play, because it needs 5 and it counts itself. So it's not great early in the game, but if you get to turn 5, it's 2 mana on 1 land. That's great in this deck. Much like Soul Ring, sometimes you have to split up that mana over the course of 2 spells, but that's still fine. A little bit of ramp on your lands, even if that ramp is a little slow, helps you. Then we're running 3 utility lands. I put Demolition Field in basically all my decks. I think it's really useful. It's a little slow in this deck, just because this deck wants to go so fast, but it's still worth having in case we need it. It comes in untapped and taps for colorless, or we can pay 2, tap, and sack it to destroy a non-basic land that an opponent controls, and then they get to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield untapped, and so do we. So neither of us are down a land. They just have lost their Maze of Ith or their Rogue's Passage, whatever may be a troubling land for us. We don't want to do mass land denial, but being able to answer a specific land is probably a good idea. We do have Chaos Warp in this deck, which will also answer a land, but Demolition Field is a little bit nicer, and it makes it so that we both have an untapped basic. So the only way someone's losing out for that is if they're not running 34 basics, well, if they don't have any more basics left. We have a Forgotten Cave. Forgotten Cave is like a mountain that comes in tapped. It enters tapped and it taps for red, but it also cycles for a single red. So if early game rather, we need a red source, even if it slows us down a bit because it comes in tapped, we have a red source. If later in the game we've got plenty of mana, like maybe we've just cast a Dragon's Approach, our commander is triggered and put a red mana in our mana pool, we can then use that mana to cycle Forgotten Cave, maybe draw something better. Finally, we have War Room. War Room comes in untapped and taps for a colorless mana, or we can pay 3 and tap it and pay life equal to the number of colors in our commander's color identity, which is to say 1 life, and draw a card. 3 mana plus tapping the War Room and paying a life to draw a card. I have in my testing never had to do this, but it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So a little bit of card advantage in our land base can't hurt. Same reason we've got Forgotten Cave that we can cycle. So that about sums it up. This was Urabrask. Again, I'm making a deck for each of the March of the Machine legends, so let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a specific commander or style of deck for that commander. Thanks for watching, everyone. As usual, make sure to like and subscribe, and remember, Magic is fun. You should play more Magic.